I'm delighted to share the next 25 minutes alongside three dear collaborators and friends. As today's theme is around the culture of innovation and empowering well-being, I would like to introduce the three panelists in a more wholehearted way, as you can read more about them professionally in their bios. So I'm going to start with Faye Horwitt. Faye is an ecosystem healer. She supports communities, ecosystems, and entrepreneurs heal as they reimagine, repair, and rebuild their local ecosystems. Every conversation I share with Faye is full of heart and insights, as she has a natural ability to connect and understand individuals, organizations, and communities from a multicultural lens. One fun fact about Faye is that she was formerly in the military, though we won't say which branch. Susan O'Malley is a champion of people and how we work together. She has an incredible energy and enthusiasm that you can feel in each interaction with her. And she's on a mission to design more authentic, holistic teams and organizations to achieve another level of impact and success through cultivating culture and creativity. One fun fact about Susan is that she's an avid brass musician playing multiple brass instruments. And Tony, he's our third panelist today. He's one of the most caring and thoughtful humans I know, who brings out and invites the best in people. He has a wonderful presence and way of listening and seeing individuals and the unique dynamics of teams, and understands how to unlock innovation and create shared value. One fun fact about Tony is that he once worked out with Mike Tyson while in Miami. So welcome, Faye, Susan, and Tony. Before we jump into our first question, since we have a really brief jam-packed session together, I wanted to mention a couple quick things. I may hold up this heart during the session as an invitation to wrap up your thought so we can dive into another question. And then because we have limited opportunities for engagement during this session with those of you listening and watching, I wanted to just share that our intention is to really talk with you, not to you. And so we have a couple questions we've queued up to get your input and thoughts. The first one should hopefully be popping up in the interactive polls now. And we'd love to also continue this conversation beyond this panel as well. Alrighty, let's get into it. So today we're talking about the value of investing in culture, ecosystems, and innovations. Tony, we're going to start with you. As you coach and work with many Fortune 100 companies and executives, love to hear your thoughts on what themes you've seen that set them apart from their competitors and peers.
Yeah, great question, Christine. So I think it really ties in nicely with our subject. I see organizations and leaders who can kind of create a culture where everyone is involved in innovation. We kind of consider it innovation by all. And as this happened in 2019, we did some research. We surveyed over almost 750,000 employees, over 800 companies. And what we found is that those companies that are doing really well are actually engaging a lot of people in the innovation process. And I'm not talking about like traditional sort of structured innovation process, but just getting people involved on a daily basis. And our data showed that really there's like three categories of companies. The best companies, for every 11 people who are involved in innovation, there are only 2 who say they aren't. The worst case scenario, you have 3 people who are involved and 2 who aren't. So it's almost like a trade-off. And you probably wonder, why is that important? Well, that 11 to 2, those companies, if you look at the results of how do they feel about the work they do and wanting to be a part of that work, how agile are they to change and how ready are they for change? There's almost like a 20-point difference between those 2. So we're in this place right now, whether it's a country, an organization, or individuals, we're kind of betwixt and between. We're not what we used to be. We're not quite what we're going to be. And innovation isn't a nice to do, but it's almost a must do. And it shows that when you engage everyone, regardless of who they are, in innovation, it just doesn't create great things for the organization, but it also creates a great culture. It makes people want to come to work. It makes them feel good about changes. And it also makes them feel good about endorsing the organization they're with. So those leaders are really creating a culture of innovation by all.
Nice, cool, thanks, Tony. And then do you have any, I guess like you always have such great stories. I'm curious if you have any tips or things that you'd share with folks who are really looking to kind of strengthen that muscle, I guess, around innovation with their teams.
Yeah, I think the tips is really, we also looked at what are the characteristics of the leaders within these organizations. And we found some unique things about the leader. It's nothing scientific, it's not breakthrough, but those leaders were high trust leaders. They trusted everyone, regardless of who they are, regardless of their representation. They also were good bridge builders. Their employees told us that they build great bridges between groups. So they're not just focused on the success of their group, but they're willing to focus on the success of other groups. There's also this humility. They step back and not always take the lead. They let other people step in and take that lead. And then one of the things also that their employees are telling us, they create space, safe space for people to try things and not worry about making mistakes. So it was really an atmosphere those leaders are creating led to the results that we were seeing from the survey.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. Really great to know kind of what you're seeing from a broader perspective. And as we know, companies consist of teams, which consist of people. Susan, I'd love to turn to you next. How might some of those, how might you challenge those in the audience in thinking about their talent and their teams?
Absolutely. It's a great pleasure to be here. The mental image I have in my mind the past couple of years on this topic is what I call the human stack or the people stack. And the analog here is the technology stack, right? We make, particularly in technology focused modern organizations, we make choices about every piece of the stack from the front end through the middle to the back end. And the three points about the stack I would make that feel relevant for this conversation are purpose and values, rituals and norms, and then things like tools and solutions, right? And I think at every level, it's important to be intentional about how are we supporting the type of culture innovation and the type of outcomes that we want. There's a lot we can say about each of those directions, but I would just give you a very short point on each one. On the value side, I think it's super important that we understand our values and that we actually question if we have the right ones and that they're not just abstractions sitting on the wall, that they actually help us be better, do our job better. IDEO's values are published a lot, written about a lot, and what I really love about them is that they contain phrases like embrace ambiguity or make others successful. And it would actually be very difficult to be a successful designer or innovator at IDEO if you didn't do those things. The second point I would make is that rituals are really important in terms of designing them and testing them and talking about what's culturally appropriate for you. And here again, rituals shouldn't just be things that you copy from other companies or that you read about in books. That might be a fine starting point, but you really want them to be authentic to your culture and you want them to also make you better at your job. The third point I won't go into, which is around technology and tools. I think a lot of us over the past 4 or 5 months have flipped overnight to many, many new ways of working. And some of that has been fine and some of it has been good. And I think a question that's top of mind for me right now is how do we move from good to great with that? And how do we actually be even more intentional about workflow design in putting the human back in these systems to make it excellent and not just a thing that's, hobbling along with a Band-Aid.
Nice. And then have a same thing. You have such great stories and examples of so many clients and folks that you've worked with. Do you have any fun stories or examples you'd like to share that kind of really enforce the human stack?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably my favorite example is some work that I did with a veteran services organization that had a really, really entrepreneurial mission and spirit, and we were helping that set of folks scale into a new context in a set of countries. And we used the design process of looking in, doing empathy and research, and then prototyping and storytelling to help them really understand what was the magic of what made them work and tick. And they knew that they had a great culture and a great early team, but as they were going to scale that up into dozens and hundreds of new people, they didn't really have kind of the energy or headspace to design that intentionally. And so taking a moment to bring in some outside coaches and friends and facilitators to really look at what was driving them, what was driving their mission and their entrepreneurial spirit was really powerful, I think. And so that was one of my favorite stories. And actually, on a more personal level, I came to know how innovative some of the working models and norms within the military cultures are, and took a lot from that. And I think there's a tremendous amount that obviously business and nonprofits can learn from organizations that are often set up or founded by military veterans.
Awesome. The great story for this audience in particular. Thanks, Susan. And I think the way that we were kind of thinking about this panel too was Tony really sharing things from a more macro perspective from a lot of different companies he's working with. Susan really kind of getting into the teams and the culture and how that works. And Faye, I think really turning to you, actually, I'm getting some of the responses from the interactive poll. And one of them around innovation is hearing voices at all levels. And I think you are one of the best people when I think about in terms of really incorporating that inclusive environment, really making sure people are heard and seen, especially because you work in cities and communities. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what makes an ecosystem equitable, inclusive, resilient, and robust.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I'm really glad to be here. So when we at Forward Cities, we help communities all around the country to build more equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. And we like to look at ecosystems and their health and resilience through the lens of a concept we call ABIDE. And that acronym stands for access, belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity.
Oh, wait, can you say it again, Faye, real quick? That's so good.
Yes, most definitely. Access, belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity. And I know lots of times those terms get intermingled, or people pick one or two, but really we believe that all are important. And just to sort of break it down a little bit, one of the key elements, some of the key elements is that everyone in the community needs to have the same access to information and opportunities. In addition, there should be an intentionality of creating environments, spaces, and teams where everyone feels as though they belong without having to change their identity or who they are, as long as it's not harmful to others. Organizations should strive for inclusion. And this is not only about participation, but one of the key things that popped up in the word cloud was leadership. And so not just participation, but leadership, diversity, and inclusion is really key. What you do, how you do it, your engagement, your messaging, your social media, all needs to lean in an inclusive direction. And there should be a clear understanding across an ecosystem that true diversity does not happen by accident. And I think this is something that everyone that tends to happen. People just think that we're open to all. They say we're open to all, and everyone just shows up. And the expectation is that diversity will naturally occur. And that's not the case. Often you have to be intentional about the invitation, and intentional to invite people that are different in the way they look, think, and behave. And because diversity of perspective is such a keystone for true innovation. And lastly, there needs to be acknowledgement, particularly in this day and time, that communities and ecosystems have a legacy of inequity, and all the isms, racism, sexism, gender bias. We are in an environment now where we have to look back and understand who we are and our history as a nation so that we can look forward. And so equity means, in this context, just a clear effort to level the playing field. And essentially all of these things, access, belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity, are all about putting people and relationships first. And that is really what's going to be the bedrock of a strong ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you, Faye. And I think similar to what I kind of opened with Tony and Susan too, you also have so many incredible stories from the communities that you work with. Is there one that might come to mind to kind of really put it into perspective or put it into light for people, how ecosystems really, in focusing on people, diversity, all of the things that really gets folks to be seen? Do you have a good example or story to share?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that stands out the most are stories wrapped around when communities are able to recognize their own autonomy and value, and see themselves see their own assets. There's one community that we work with, and there have been some challenges because they had been systemically underinvested, and they were constantly they were really frustrated about where can we get. Why will no one fund our work? Why are we always left out? What does this, how can we overcome this? And the work that we did with them was really about leaning in and having them to name their own assets. And we got in a room, got in a whiteboard, and began to ask, what do you bring to the table personally, your organization, your community? And we filled up a 6-foot whiteboard to the point where we had to flip it over and fill in the other side. Nice. And then I reached out to that community, in that council setting where we were working, and I said, how much money do you think these assets that you've listed are worth? And they said, easily $1 million. And in that moment, there was this sense of just huge aha, that you don't have to wait for someone to give you. If you can see within a community, within your ecosystem, your own value and assets, but you have to be willing to share them. That's why that's worth $1 million. It's not worth $1 million individually, but it's about the collective and the whole, and everyone bringing what they have to the table for the benefit of the whole.
Beautiful, Faye. I think even though we haven't explicitly talked about serendipity, and that was kind of what we incorporated into our title, there's so much of what each of you have shared that is, I call it the invisible work, right? It's the things that are really relational that we can't really sometimes want to put a value on it because it's invaluable. And so I'm seeing some questions in the comments coming in. I'd love to kind of pose it to anyone that wants to jump in. What's the recommended org structure to foster diversity? And then if there's any insights into how we can also make that happen, since we're in a virtual Zoom environments nowadays too. Curious thoughts from anyone.
I'll jump in and say, it's not necessarily about the organizational structure as it is about about the relationships and the opportunities you provide for people. And so if you can provide the more opportunities you can provide for collaboration and for equity of voice, the better. And often, particularly in this sort of physically distanced world we're living in, it's a unique opportunity. This is why we like to use things like digital polls, because it allows people to express a voice before someone else who typically will be out front and speak loudly and, take up all the energy and air in the room does. So we like to use it because it allows everyone to feel like they have a voice and can share their insights, their perspectives without being overshadowed by others. And so the more opportunity you can have in your organizational environment to allow people to speak first or speak collectively at the same time, that takes away that inequity.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Faye. I think another thing that I heard and the way that I read the question too, it's almost like this org structure, like, is it written on a chart? Because if it's like physically somewhere, but then how are we actually interacting with each other and living that and showing up for each other? And so I appreciate you really kind of like taking what could be written on paper in terms of our org structure, and then what does it actually look like in practice in terms of the ways that we interact and engage. Tony, did you have some thoughts you wanted to share?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I totally agree. And I feel like the structure is important based on what you're trying to get done. But the feeling of fairness comes from the relationship that I have, especially with leaders. And our data shows that there's still a huge gap. Leaders feel like things are almost 3 times more fair than people of color or women. And so it's really understanding how people are experiencing the workplace and the organization. And you can only do that through deeply listening to their experience. But there's still, even in best companies, there's still this huge gap. So regardless of structure, it's more about what's the relationship like, and am I aware of the disconnect that exists still today?
So that's such a nugget of wisdom, Tony. And I sometimes describe you as like a CEO whisperer. So if I was a CEO, what would you coach me on? Because like, I hear you, I hear what you're saying. How do I actually put that into practice? Like, I'm like, okay, I'm listening. I'm actively, deeply listening. Yeah. But like, how do I make sure I'm actively like soaking that in? Like, what do you have anything that you would share with someone who's like, I get it intellectually, but how do I actually show up in that way?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You brought up the key word, listen. And so I want to listen, and I really have to listen to hear. Sometimes as leaders, we listen to respond and do something, but that's not the key. We have to listen first to hear, and then listen to learn, and then we want to listen to respond. And so there's levels of listening. I think it's really important. But it really starts with knowing where you are right now, collecting data and understanding the current situation, and then getting into a more listening mode. Because we often go into emergency response and try to fix things, and that doesn't really get us where we need to be. Cool.
Thanks for sharing that. Susan, I'm curious if you have some thoughts to share as well.
Absolutely. I really love everything that Faye and Tony have already shared. The one build I would have is that I think it's spot on saying that it's not really about structures and about some of the things Faye described. I would throw in the words practices and processes. What Tony's talking about is about how leaders or just colleagues or collaborators show up every day. I think we sometimes forget, particularly on video, we forget the effect we have on each other and the effect that our energy brings in. And so being intentional during this time when we're at a remove, we're away from our, the typical conditions of work is huge. And I would say that on a really practical level, I know we have a connection with Vegas and AFWERX, the responsive org culture and folks at Zappos who've been incredible innovators in the culture world. There's a lot of really neat little micro practices from responsive org design around having everybody check into a meeting, turn taking, getting every voice in the meeting heard, right? I really like inviting more mid-level or junior people to state their intention at the start of the meeting so that it removes that barrier for them jumping in later on in the conversation, maybe where there's an inequitable power structure. So I'm a big believer in these micro practices that we can try out with each other as teams. And I would say, well, I think structure is not the leading idea. I am a really big fan of the ideas of General Stanley McChrystal and his folks at the McChrystal Group, structuring team of teams, structuring fusion cells, having at IDEO, we call them interdisciplinary teams. I think these are really key ideas, and they're almost free or inexpensive to implement. And I would really encourage folks who are not familiar with that methodology to check it out, because it's an unstoppable force for good, I think, in our organizations.
Awesome. Another great share, Susan. I have a question that just came in. I think it's really interesting talking what you just touched upon, Susan, like being able to invite those voices and acknowledge them. And so this is an interesting question. I'm curious again, how can leaders reward innovation to foster an appropriate environment? And the way that I kind of receive that too is like kind of what you mentioned, Faye. It's kind of like the way that we reward the voices, like are there other ways that we can actually reward innovation and how that kind of shows up? So I'm curious what may come up for anyone.
Yeah, I would say sometimes you have to really listen. If new ideas and innovation emerge, as leaders, be willing to pivot away from your plan, the way you saw it, the way you intended to do it, and to really, the reward is actually putting into practice this new emerging idea or innovation that comes from your team. And sometimes that has to mean letting go of what your vision of what you thought it should be.
Nice, that's a good one.
I believe we like to reward the outcome, but there's also the opportunity to reward the learning that comes from the process. And so whether it ends up being a great idea or not, what do we learn from that? And being able to really reward the learning process is also very important.
Yeah, that's awesome, Tony. One of my personal practices, New Year's resolutions and things like that, people are like, what are your goals? And I was like, I don't really do goals anymore. I do intention, because even just a language of like, I have a goal and I'm going to be like dead set on how I get there versus I have an intention. I know where I want to go, but I'm open to the serendipity. I'm open to the inputs of our team. I'm open to what shows up and how we constellate together. Susan, I felt like something may have aha'd for you. Do you have something you want to add?
I was really just a +1. I think that's spot on, the intention and the learning. And process is one of these words I have a love-hate relationship with, because I'm not a bureaucratic person, and I often feel hemmed in by structure. But I do think that teams having vocabulary and being inclusive and listening and being flexible in the language we use to describe what we're doing is a huge one as well, right? Not everybody might have the same education or the same access to tools, but they have amazing ideas. And so I think what Tony's saying is spot on. How do we focus on the learning and the intention and not just the outcome? And that doesn't mean that we're just failing and moving along. It means that there's actually a lot more unpacking and understanding to do when we try things out, and they don't always succeed.
Cool. Thanks, Susan. I've got another interesting question. I'm trying to parse it out live as I'm reading it, but I'll just read it out loud. Is this virtual world allowing us to reach more people, all voices, or are we losing more in-person touch within our existing teams? What are the trade-offs to those things?
I think it allows us to reach more people, but I think we have to be we have to acknowledge the cognitive load that it puts on people. And so as I move from one meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting, it's almost like I have a social contract with this group, and this group. And it's hard to do that in person, but when we're in technology-driven world, it gets even harder because we don't have the cues we can pick up on. And so as leaders, we almost have to manage the chessboard and know how much our people are engaged in Zoom type meetings, because as we're moving from meeting to meeting to meeting, that's moving from one social group to another one. And the cognitive load is really telling in the long run. And so we're not getting the best out of our people if we don't manage that.
That's a great way to think about it. I can just imagine it's like Zooming from one room to another versus having to get up, walk to another room. All right, so I got the time warning that we're going to wrap up soon. We can clearly go on for many more hours. Wanted to invite each of you to kind of share a closing thought that you'd love the audience to kind of hear, maybe invite them to kind of do. And then let's pop up the second question in terms of what your takeaways are, but let's open up a closing round.
Yeah, I would say that I'd like to leave with people with asking you to think about, interestingly enough, it's a word that you don't hear often in business, but that's grace. This is a very unique time in our history and in our nation. And we have to understand that everyone is going through a bit of a trauma together, multiple traumas. And while still trying to accomplish our work and fulfill our goals, while having kids and children at home that we're taking care of that are not in school, and spouses, and we're opening up our homes and our lives to other people in a way that's unprecedented. And so just being able to look at one another and look at your teams, and as leaders really have a true sense of grace for yourself and for others in this time, I think is extremely important.
Mhm.
Thank you, Faye.
I think that I'd build on that. That's great. And Susan mentioned values earlier, and I feel like we need to lead with and make decisions based on our values, because we all have these great values and they just can't be artifacts that are on the wall, but we actually have to make decisions based on those values and lead based on those values. I think that helps get us through the environment that Faye described. It's like this unprecedented time. We have to lead with our values.
Nice. Susan?
Wonderful. I would say that the words of he's a computer scientist and a Nobel laureate, but I heard this phrase from an old colleague and mentor of mine, which is, "We design whenever we shape the world to meet our needs," by Herbert Simon. And I think it's a really powerful idea in this moment, and particularly in this moment for the world of work. There are so many choices we have and can make every day about our systems and our people and how we treat each other and respect each other. And I think there's never been a better time to question our assumptions about how we're working, who we're hiring, how we're creating opportunities, all of these things. I would encourage this group and would welcome dialogue on let's question some of our assumptions and design a better way forward.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for those closing words. And again, thank you, Faye, Susan, and Tony for sharing your insight, your presence, your time. It's so much appreciated. I hope everyone is taking away some new ideas, perspective, and thoughts. Feel free to reach out to Faye, Susan, and Tony via LinkedIn or Twitter to continue the conversation. And thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the programming for the day.
Here.
So much.
Thank you.
Bye.